Chapter 7. Bakker was suddenly awake. He knew he had been sleeping with the clarity of thought and senses that only comes in the second of reawakening. Immediately he was on his feet and looking round. Something had disturbed his rest. Probably it was just a gust of wind, but it might be a jackal or some other potential danger. Since he was the lookout, he should be aware of whatever it was. If he failed to give the alarm in good time, he could forfeit some or all of his meagre wages. And that was all the money he and his family would have to live on for the next month at least. All seemed in order. The breeze was getting up now after the calm earlier in the evening. Bakker completed a second tour of the camp without incident, and made his way finally towards the excavations. He paused on the ridge above the entrance to the pyramid and peered down into the pit. Again, all was quiet. But just as Bakker was about to move away, a faint glow caught his eye. It was coming from the doorway into the pyramid. A trick of the light, surely, a star reflecting from the darkly polished stone. But he had better check. There was nothing else to do, after all. Bakker stumbled his way down the steep side of the pit, his bare feet sinking into the soft ground and sending warm sand skidding down ahead of him. He was forced to increase speed as he made his way down, and almost pitched over when he arrived at the bottom. Regaining his balance, Bakker saw that the door into the pyramid was standing ajar. The faint glow he had noticed earlier was growing steadily brighter, and the wind rolled around the bottom of the excavations, moaning and buffeting its trapped way round the hollow. Bakker edged closer to the doorway, stepping lightly and feeling the fear rising in his stomach. He leaned forward and peered round the edge of the door into the corridor beyond. With a sigh of relief that was lost in the sound of the wind, he saw that the glow came from an oil lamp held by the leading figure of a group of people heading down the corridor towards him. Assuming that the party inside the pyramid consisted of Kenilworth and his colleagues, Bakker pushed the door fully open and raised a hand in greeting. He was keen to show that he had been keeping his vigil efficiently enough to know that they were there. But as the figure carrying the lamp reached the entrance, Bakker could see that it was not Kenilworth. It was Simmons. Simmons, with skin so pale it almost glowed in the lamplight. Simmons, with deep, dark, sunken eyes which reflected nothing. Simmons, with sunken cheeks and dried blood down the side of his face and staining his jacket. Simmons, who had been dead for days. Bakker was still struggling to understand what was happening when Simmons gave a short nod to the figure behind him. It stepped forward out of the pyramid and in front of the light so that all Bakker could see was the silhouette. The silhouette of a huge frame, arms outstretched as they reached towards him. The enormous bandaged hands closed like clamps around Bakker's neck, and he felt the edges of the linen wrappings as they bit into his throat. His choked cry drifted away, lost in the sound of the wind. Atkins was awakened by the noise. He glanced at his pocket watch, laid out neatly on the chair beside his camp bed. It was early, too early for the camp to be rousing, but he could hear the Egyptians shouting to each other, though not clearly enough to make out what they were saying. He pulled on his clothes, checked his tie in a small shaving mirror resting beside a bowl of cold water, and set off towards the sound. The Egyptian workers were all gathered round the supply tent. They seemed to be having a conference of some sort, huddled together and all talking at once. Kenilworth and Macready stood nearby, obviously having dressed hurriedly. Atkins guessed they too had been roused by the noise. They were conversing in low tones with the doctor, whose attire seemed as casually immaculate as ever. "I am sorry, sir. I failed to appreciate that there was an incident until just now." Kenilworth nodded to Atkins and completed his words to the doctor. "We still have some blasting dynamite from the excavations. I could arrange to blow the sand down into the pit and cover the entrance completely." The doctor shook his head. "No point, really. I think whatever it was has already happened. The desert will close up the excavation site and seal up the pyramid again in a week or two anyway." "We shall be long gone by then," Macready said. "Too late for... what did you say his name was?" "Backer," Kenilworth said. Atkins listened to the exchange in puzzlement. Backer was one of the workers, a second cousin of Nebka. He was lazy and slept when he should be on watch, but neither of those traits marked him out to Atkins as unusual. "May I ask what has occurred?" Atkins asked when it became clear that nobody was going to enlighten him. "One of the workers got himself killed last night," Macready said. "Murdered," Kenilworth added. As Kenilworth said the word, everything round them went quiet, giving it emphasis and volume. Atkins could remember once chiding one of the maids about her sloppy service at table, just as there was a lull in the dinner conversation, so that his reprimand carried clear and loud across the dining room. The effect now was the same. "Sir?" "Strangled," the doctor said, "though it's a moot point whether he asphyxiated first or died of a broken neck." "The Egyptians aren't pleased." Macready wiped his glistening brow. "They're having some sort of debate about it." Kenilworth was looking round, aware of the sudden silence. "Good job we're leaving today. Wake the others, would you, Atkins? Tell them to pack up so we can leave as soon as possible." "Of course, sir." He turned to go, and almost collided with Tegan as she ran up to them. Behind her, Atkins could see Nebka standing alone by the supply tent. "Hey," said Tegan, "what's going on? I was nearly knocked down just now by a herd of Egyptians running into the desert." They all looked towards the supply tent, where Nebka was shaking his head, waving his hands up and down, and starting towards them. Atkins knew now why it had become so quiet, knew what enthusiastic debate had been so vocal to begin with. The Egyptians had gone. Despite the dryness of the air, Simmons's body was starting to smell. Rasool assumed that the heat did not help, and tried to keep upwind of him. The huge, bandaged service robots lumbered onwards without discomfort, and when they paused, it was for Rasool and the two Egyptians to rest. Simmons periodically stopped and stared at the sky, as if taking bearings. His cracked lips moved slightly as he spoke beneath what had been his breath. On the third day following Kenilworth's expedition, Simmons stumbled and almost fell. He gathered himself together immediately and continued. After the next time he paused to consult the heavens, he turned to Rasool. "The power relay is not functioning at full capacity," he said. "Probably the sand that now buries so much of it is impeding its efficiency." "Is that why you are weakened?" Rasool asked. He had noticed Simmons dragging his left foot slightly over the last few miles. Looking back, the marks Simmons had left in the soft sand were skewed lines rather than imprints. Simmons nodded in reply. "As the relics are taken from the tomb, so the power is dissipated." "What must we do?" "The time is not yet," Simmons said, his bloodshot eyes drifting upwards again. "When the time comes, as it must and will, you will collect the relics together with the mummy. But until then, to preserve power, we must return at least some of them to the tomb to act as a focus for the psionic particle accelerator." "When do we need to do this?" "Tonight." Simmons turned, and Rasool followed his gaze. In the middle distance, the four mummies continued their ponderous march forwards. "I shall take the services and recover the relics." "And the woman?" asked Rasool. "The mummy?" "Her destiny is already charted." They were one day out from Cairo, and Margaret Evans could not sleep. She lay awake, knowing that she needed to sleep, but somehow that made it even more difficult to relax. The full moon outside shone in through the canvas of her tent, so that she could see the outline of the interior lit with a pale glow of diffuse light. She stared at the low folding table on which her most precious belongings were laid out, and tried to distinguish them in the gloom. Her mother's ring lay beside her daybook. She could not see it, but she knew that sticking out slightly from the book, marking the current page, was the edge of a photograph. It was the only photograph she possessed, and one of the few she had ever seen. It showed her father standing outside the Royal Society just before his acclaimed lecture on the discoveries at Saqqara in 1893. And beside him, on the steps, stood Nicholas Simmons. Margaret Evans took the photograph everywhere, and those who knew quietly admired her quiet dedication to, and love of, her father. As she struggled to make out the strip of card, imagining its faded sepia tones, and remembering the occasions she had cried herself to sleep clutching it, Margaret Evans felt the edges of sleep beginning to come over her. She relaxed slightly, trying not to be aware that she was drifting off, afraid that if she admitted to herself that she was falling asleep, she would be instantly awake again. The pillow was soft under her head, and her nightgown and the blankets held the warmth to her. She felt herself slipping away, sinking into the thin mattress. Her view of the dim interior of the tent softened and darkened, the effect of falling asleep emphasized by the dark shadow cast against the far wall of the tent. Someone was walking past the tent, their shadow cast by the moon against the canvas. It was stretched and distorted by the irregular shape of the material as it lurched its way past. Margaret watched the figure's progress, barely aware that she was wide awake again. She pushed back the covers and pushed herself off the bed. She had recognized the figure's shape. She reached the front of the tent just as the figure passed and continued its slow progress through the small camp. She called out, called in by name, and the figure stopped, turned, and walked slowly back towards her. "It is you. I was sure it was. Oh, I'm so relieved. What happened? Are you all right?" The figure stopped in front of her. His face was illuminated by the light from the moon, and Margaret could see the sunken eyes and the pallor of the skin. She was vaguely aware of the smell, too, but did not associate the stench of rotting flesh with the man standing in front of her. Simmons said nothing. His expression did not alter. Margaret sniffed, then shook her head to dispel the odour. Part of her mind was wondering how they could have been so wrong in their diagnosis of Simmons's condition, and wondered where he had been. Most of it did not care. She shook her head, wiped her eye, and laughed in relief. "I've missed you so much, so very much. We thought you were dead." She reached out for him, but Simmons took a step backwards. "I'm sorry, you're nervous, I know, but you seemed so confident as you walked past just now, so assured. I thought you were looking for me. I thought that you knew, that you understood." She broke off and looked closer at Simmons's gaunt face. The smell was stronger now, and she was finding it difficult to breathe without coughing. Simmons blinked once. The skin round his eyes seemed to tighten, and his brow creased as if in concentration. Had the light been better, Margaret might have seen the skin of his forehead cracking and breaking as it furrowed. Had her concentration not been entirely focused on Simmons's eyes, she might have smelled the colourless viscous fluid which trickled down his cheek. "Margaret," he said. His voice was quiet and husky, and it sounded as if the words had been forced out of him. "You are Margaret." "Of course," she said. She stretched out her arms to him. "Don't be nervous. Don't avoid me. Not now." Simmons moved forward, his hands reaching out. Margaret stepped back as he took her shoulders. She retreated into her tent, feeling the cold of his grasp through the material of her nightgown. She felt the camp bed against the backs of her knees and sat down on it. Simmons lifted his hands slowly to her neck, and she closed her eyes, lifting her head towards his. She tried not to flinch when the stench grew stronger as he leaned forward, pushing her back onto the bed. Any moment she expected to feel his lips on hers, though she knew they would be pale and cold as death. And when she opened her mouth, it was not to kiss, but to gasp desperately for breath. The scream tore through the camp like a knife through tent canvas. Tegan was wide awake and out of bed by the time it finished. She pulled on her cloak and ran out of her tent. The doctor collided with her as she left the tent. He stared at her for a moment, and for a split second Tegan could see the relief in his eyes. Then he turned and started running in the opposite direction. "Margaret?" Tegan asked. "Margaret," he agreed. Kenilworth and Atkins were leaving their tents as the doctor and Tegan ran past. "What the devil's going on?" Kenilworth called as he struggled into his jacket. The doctor did not answer, but kept running. Tegan followed as fast as she could. Margaret's tent was silent. The flap was pulled back, and the doctor paused outside for a second like a doubting disciple. Then he dived inside. Tegan arrived a few seconds after he had gone in and made to follow. But the doctor was backing out of the tent. He turned sharply as he bumped into Tegan and opened his mouth. Then he shut it again and shook his head. Behind the doctor, Tegan could see the figure sprawled across the bed, white nightgown stained at the shoulders as if charred. Margaret's head lolled back over the far side of the bed, and Tegan was thankful that the eyes were hidden. She knew they would be open and blank, the pupils dilated in the gloom. Before either of them could comment, Atkins and Kenilworth arrived, out of breath and hurriedly dressed. Atkins, for once, was less than immaculate. But before any of them could speak, there was a shout from across the camp and the sound of a shotgun. The main focus of attention was the supply tent. Evans and Macready were backing slowly away from it. Macready had a shotgun raised and aimed to cover their retreat. Approaching them out of the darkness were three enormous shapes. They lumbered forwards, rolling from one leg to the other as if pulling their huge bulk forward by their own momentum. Tegan, the doctor, Atkins and Kenilworth arrived just as Macready discharged the second barrel of his gun. Tegan skidded to a halt and grabbed the doctor for support, both to prevent her falling as the sand gave under her feet, and for reassurance. Atkins stood open-mouthed, and Kenilworth swore. The three figures were clearly visible in the moonlight. The shadows moved and stretched across their frames as they continued their slow but inexorable progress towards the group. The size of the bandaged bodies and the way the arms hung out from the massive shoulders made their legs seem slightly out of proportion as the huge mummies stepped through the desert night. Macready's shot caught the leading mummy in the right shoulder. It slowed a little, the right side of his body pushed back by the impact, shreds of bandage flying from the tiny entry points of the lead pellets. But then it eased itself back into its rolling gait and continued without apparent discomfort towards them. Macready broke open the gun and fumbled in his pocket for fresh cartridges. "I wouldn't bother if I were you," the doctor said. "There are siren service robots. A few bullets and a bit of buckshot won't worry them." "And what would you suggest?" Kenilworth asked. "I'd suggest we run." "Admirable advice," Evans said, turning on his heel. The mummies continued their slow progress. One of them smashed its way through the edge of a tent standing in its path. Another kicked through a small mound of sand in front of it. The mound exploded into tiny particles and drifted away on the breeze. Behind them, the sound of splintering wood carried through the desert air. Silhouetted against the canvas of the supply tent, working by the light of the oil lamp which cast its shadows onto the tent wall, a huge shape ripped the top from one of the packing cases. Two smaller, thinner figures stood close by, watching. The doctor and his friends turned to follow Evans's example, just as the entrance to the tent nearest the leading mummy flapped open and Nebka pushed his sleepy way into its path. "Look out, man!" shouted Macready. "Run!" Kenilworth and the doctor both called together. But Nebka was frozen to the spot, staring in horror and amazement at the mummy as it bore down on him. At last he shook himself free of the fear and started to turn. But too late. The mummy swiped, almost casually, at the Egyptian. Its arm caught him across the throat, sending him flying back at the tent he had just left. Nebka hit the doorway, his body colliding with the tent's main support and bringing it crashing down. A hand and forearm emerged from the mass of collapsed canvas. The hand clutched at the sand, grabbing and clinching, trying to gain a purchase on the shifting ground. Then it spasmed, stiffened, and the grains of sand fell from between the outstretched fingers, and the hand flopped back onto the desert floor. Kenilworth was already running forwards. Atkins tried to grab him, but missed. He started to follow, but the doctor held him back and shook his head. "Get the dynamite," he said. "I'll get Kenilworth." Atkins looked at the doctor for a second. Then he nodded and ran. "Help him, Tegan!" Tegan followed Macready at her heel. Evans was already almost out of sight. Kenilworth drew up short of the mummies. He could see that it was too late to help Nebka, but he was committed. Having challenged the mummies by running back at them, he was damned if he would turn and run away again. A piece of broken wood from Nebka's tent post had landed almost at Kenilworth's feet. He picked it up, a pole about 2 inches in diameter and 3 feet long with a jagged and sharp end. He took up a position like an enthusiastic cricketer out for a slog and waited for the first mummy to reach him. Before it was within reach, though, he felt himself lifted from behind and dragged away. "What the—" he spluttered, as the doctor deposited him in the sand. "Not a very sensible approach, your lordship," the doctor said. "You had even less chance of inflicting any serious damage than Macready's shotgun." "Maybe," Kenilworth said grudgingly, "but I'd have had a damn good try." "I admire your spirit, but I think we should keep out of their way." "We can't let them just ransack the place," Kenilworth protested as he dragged himself to his feet, looked carefully at the length of wood he was holding, and then dropped it to the ground. The doctor was backing away again, the mummies still lurching towards them. "They're not. They're after something specific. Something in with the relics." "We've still got to stop them," Kenilworth spluttered. "Oh, I agree. That's why I've sent Atkins for the dynamite." The doctor's teeth gleamed in the moonlight as he smiled. Over his shoulder, Kenilworth saw the mummies slow to a halt. For a moment, their bodies swung to and fro as if they were surveying the land in front of them. Then they stood motionless. From the distance came the sound of another crate being ripped open. Between them, Tegan and Atkins managed to carry the box of dynamite towards the supply tent. Tegan expected any moment to meet the doctor and Kenilworth running back the other way, but they were almost where they had left them. The mummies stood a short way off, making no effort to move. "They're stopping us from getting to the supplies and preventing whatever's happening there," Kenilworth told them. "The doctor tried circling round, but they seemed to sense that, and one of them moved to cut him off." "So what did you do, Doctor?" Atkins asked. "I decided discretion was the better part of valour," the doctor said. "Now, where's that dynamite?" Atkins pulled the lid off the heavy wooden box to reveal several sticks of dynamite, fuses dangling like rats' tails from the ends. He produced a box of lucifers from his jacket pocket. "Excellent," the doctor said, rubbing his hands together. "Now, which of you can manage a decent full toss, do you reckon?" The first stick landed short of its target. The dynamite exploded noisily, throwing sand and pieces of Nebka's tent flying into the air. The mummy, standing 5 yards from the blast, did not so much as flinch. But in the supply tent, Simmons heard the report. He sent a mental signal to the servicer with him to continue searching through the packing crates. So far, they had found the statue of Anubis, but none of the other relics had yet been recovered. Simmons picked up the small stone statue, its surface as cold as his hand, and went to investigate the noise. The image he was getting from the services outside was less than helpful, degraded and interrupted by the weakness of the power. He emerged from the tent in time to see a figure step forward into the moonlight and throw something towards the services. Simmons sent the nearest mummy forward to counter the attack. It walked right into the explosion. The dynamite went off just as the mummy stepped over it. The blast ripped its left arm from the body and shredded the bandages which protected the robot's frame. The cloth still clinging to the robot's legs ignited, and after a second, the whole body was ablaze. The mummy kept going, following its orders, a lumbering torch of guttering fire. The metal frame charred in the heat, but it held together as the creature stumbled onwards. But without the protection of its wrappings, the next explosion ripped the servicer apart. It punctured the tiny pyramid relay in the small of its back and sent shards of heated metal into the air like shrapnel from a grenade. The humans dived for cover. The other servicers stood immobile and silent. Simmons weighed up the options, hefting the Anubis statue in his dead palm. One relic would suffice. He recalled the services and made his way back to where Rasul and the Egyptians were waiting beyond the next sand dune. Evan sat at the table in his daughter's tent, leafing slowly through her daybook. He was not reading it, just turning the pages. In his hand he held the photograph that had marked her place. Atkins stood into the tent behind him, watching. "I thought I'd find you here, sir," he said after a while. He tried to ignore the body sprawled across the bed. "She loved me," Evans said without looking up. "So dedicated, so devoted." Indeed. Atkins clasped his hands tighter behind his back. "His lordship wonders if you would join us at the supply tent to go over the inventory again. He would welcome your expert opinion." "Look," Evans held out the photograph from the book. "She even kept my picture with her." Simmons's young enthusiasm smiled back at Atkins from the cracked card. "Indeed, sir. He broke off. He knew what he wanted to say, but not how to phrase it. "She will be a great loss to us all, sir." It felt inadequate. But Evans nodded as he stood up. "A great loss. Yes, yes." Atkins held back the canvas flap for Evans as he pushed past. Then Atkins looked at the figure across the bed. He could feel an unaccustomed pressure behind his eyes, was aware of a tension in his stomach. He blinked quickly and followed Evans out of the tent. Faster Osiris. Isis left the navigation to the pilot. He sat within the projection dome, his mind entirely focused on keeping the craft on course, following the side trail left by the capsule. With her mind, Isis reached out into the darkness, probing and searching for the thoughts of Osiris. At the very extreme edge of her consciousness, she could sense a slight tremor. There was a chance, just a faint hope, that Osiris was not yet dead. But if they did not get close enough for him to break the mind lock and project out of the capsule soon, he would be lost. Even as she struggled to lock on to the mind of her husband's brother, Isis felt it slip through her thoughts. Osiris was gone, and with nowhere to project to, he must be dead. No way to project his physical body into another place, no receptacle for his brilliant mind. He would imbue no Psy-child now. She brought her mind back to reality, to the interior of the pyramid. The pilot was standing in front of her. He had left the projection dome, and yet the craft was still travelling straight and true along the side trail. It took a phenomenal amount of energy to cope, even with a slight mental lapse. Actually, to leave the dome was impossible. No mind could summon the reserves of power necessary for that. But as she stared into the glowing eyes of the pilot, Isis was aware of a deeper intelligence than she had perceived when they boarded the craft. "Greetings, Mother," the pilot said. His voice was melodic, almost musical. She recognized it at once and almost wept for joy. The words of the Osiran who had been the pilot resonated within the craft, seeming almost to be born out of the air itself. "I am Horus, son of Osiris."